Hey there, I'm Jean Tiberio, and I'm a nutritionist and a wellness coach. Welcome to Healing Outside the Box. Today is episode 153, and I'm calling it, Is Food Addiction a Real Thing or a Bunch of Baloney? But first, I want to apologize for my voice. I'm at the tail end of a bad cold, and I ended up in the emergency room last week. Now let's get back to this whole issue of food addiction. I'll sum it all up in my humble little old opinion. Like our fearless leader, I have my humble opinions, and then I'll go back to the starting gate and discuss the pros and cons of labeling it as an addiction. So, is it a true addiction or not? Well, yes and no. Or maybe it is a real addiction, but it's distinct from other addictions, to say alcohol or gambling. And perhaps it's because, unlike those two addictions, food is necessary for survival. In that sense, it's more like oxygen or water. For this episode today, I will look at ways that it is like other addictions. And then next week, I'll do a part 2 on this topic and discuss what the devil's advocates might be saying. Okay, so first let's define an addiction in general terms. Addiction has been traditionally defined as people who overconsume, generally alcohol or drugs, to the point where it is self-destructive. These people often feel as if they have no control over their behaviors. It is now evident that addictive behaviors affect our brain chemicals such as dopamine. There is usually a component that's described as someone becoming more tolerant to the same dose of the alcohol or drug and needing more and more to feel the same drug effect. People are familiar with the phrase that addicts will risk their own life or hurt others to get the addictive substance. In a study titled Neurobiology of Food Addiction, these guys Daniel Blumenthal and Mark Gold state, quote, recent work on food use disorders has demonstrated that the same neurobiological pathways that are implicated in drug abuse also modulate food consumption. Work presented in this review strongly supports the notion that food addiction is a real phenomenon. Close quote. One of the more famous of the physicians who defended this belief that it's a true addiction is a woman by the name of Dr. Pamela Peeke. She wrote a book called The Hunger Fix, and she put forth some strong arguments to see food addiction in a similar way to alcohol or drug addictions. She also discusses the phenomena of cross-addiction with food, which, in my opinion, is a very real thing. I talked about this in a previous episode, and I'll try to find it for you and link it in the show notes. Basically, it goes like this. Someone who suffers from morbid obesity undergoes gastric bypass surgery. As I'm sure you're aware, the surgery cuts away most of the stomach and sometimes part of the small intestines, which will force the person to get full on very small amounts of food. They will literally vomit if that amount of food is exceeded. Although the pre-op protocol allows for some psychological counseling, it may be that deep-rooted trauma does not get fully addressed in the months prior to the surgery. After surgery, the person can no longer rely on highly palatable foods to soothe their emotions, so that person may actually begin another type of addictive behavior. This may often take the form of an addiction to alcohol or sex. So cross-addiction seems to be a real thing. But could this type of self-destructive eating be an addiction or an eating disorder? Well, more than likely it could be both. Let's go over the DSM V criteria for common eating disorders. DSM stands for the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5 meaning 5th edition. First we have anorexia nervosa, and this is the restriction of energy intake relative to requirements, leading to a significantly low body weight in the context of age, sex, and physical health. low weight is defined as weight that is less than minimally normal, or for children and adolescents, less than minimally expected. Now, that's incredibly vague, but generally speaking, dietitians, in females anyway, would look for a body fat content less than 17%, which is generally the cutoff point below which a teenager or young adult would stop menstruating. Another criteria is the intense fear of gaining weight or becoming fat, or a persistent behavior that interferes with weight gain, such as obsessive jogging. The third criteria is a disturbance in the way in which one's body weight or shape is experienced, and a persistent lack of recognition of the seriousness of the current body weight or general physical condition. Anorexics can also binge purge, or they could restrict themselves to 1 or 2 foods, such as raw carrots and lettuce. Bulimia is a separate disorder, which is marked by recurrent episodes of binge eating, sometimes followed by purging. These people eat within a short period of time and eat a very large amount of food, sometimes a complete Burger King dinner for 4 people. Now, the criteria says that the amount of food is larger than what most individuals would eat in a similar time period. But again, that's so vague as to be almost comical. But here's the criteria that makes one think that it's an addiction. This is marked by a sense of lack of control over eating during those episodes. In other words, a feeling that one cannot stop eating or control what or how much one is eating. Binge eating episodes are associated with 3 or more of the following: eating much more rapidly than normal, eating until uncomfortably full or more than likely in pain, eating large amounts of food when not feeling physically hungry, eating alone because of embarrassment, feeling disgusted with oneself, feeling depressed, and feeling very guilty afterwards. The criteria also include marked distress while binge eating. The occurrence should be once a week for 3 months to fit into the criteria. And this binge eating is not associated with obsessive thoughts of being thin. The argument for food addiction being a real thing in itself may be one or more of the following. People with food addiction may be stealing food from others. Food addiction is referred to binge eating well over or well past the morbid obesity stage, even if it is causing them pain. An example of this is someone I had seen who had fractured her toes simply by walking because the weight on her toes was so tremendous. Perhaps another characteristic that might be specific to food addiction is the physical appearance of someone after they've eaten a large meal or some donuts. A person may actually roll their head back and close their eyes, maybe even rub their stomach, as if they had taken an opioid drug. Experiments in both animals and humans show that the same reward and pleasure centers in the brain that are triggered by addictive drugs, like cocaine and heroin, are also activated by highly palatable foods. And I think you know what they are: refined sugar, fat, and salt. That expression about M&Ms, that they melt in your mouth, almost reminds us that food is soothing. These foods can trigger feel-good brain chemicals such as dopamine. Once people experience pleasure associated with increased dopamine, they may quickly feel the need to eat again. So why aren't we all addicted to food, since we need it for our survival? Dr. Pamela Peeke talks about this in her book called The Hunger Fix. She mentions that food addiction can occur if the prefrontal cortex is impaired. In that case, perhaps those reward signals from highly palatable foods may override our normal fullness and satisfaction cues. As a result, people will keep eating, and this behavior can become compulsive. People with food addictions, according to Dr. Peeke, lose control over their eating behavior and find themselves spending excessive amounts of time overeating or anticipating the emotional effects of that yummy food. As soon as they're finished eating, they're thinking about when they'll be eating again and what that food will be. She also sees that people can develop a tolerance to food, and this is where it also mimics alcohol and drugs. People tell her that they eat more and more and find the food less and less satisfying. But here's where it can also get complicated. There could be a habitual component to this. And after all, because we need food for our survival, we're not going to stop thinking about it. An example might be if we eat a Milky Way candy bar every single day at 3 p.m. If we run out of Milky Ways, we're going to crave that candy bar at 3 p.m., and it might be driving us nuts by 3:10 p.m. How much is brain chemistry, and how much of that is habit? The truth is that we just don't know. The other thing is that we associate food addiction with obesity, but normal weight people may also struggle with food addiction to some extent. For example, a person might eat raw cookie dough every day for lunch instead of eating their lunch. People who feel that they are addicted to food may also report that it hurts their relationships. That would favor the addiction model. The researchers at Yale University's Rudd Center for Food Science and Policy have developed a questionnaire to identify people who may have food addictions. Here's a sample of the questions. Do you end up eating more than planned when you start eating certain foods? Do you keep eating certain foods even if you're no longer hungry? Do you eat to the point of feeling ill? Do you worry about not eating certain types of foods or worry about cutting down on certain types of foods? When certain foods aren't available, do you go out of your way to obtain them? Do you eat so much that you eat food instead of working, spending time with your family, or doing recreational activities? Do you avoid professional or social situations where certain foods might be present? Do you have problems functioning effectively at your job or school because of food and eating? This questionnaire also tries to get at your emotions as applied to food. Does eating cause you depression, anxiety, agitation, self-loathing, guilt? Do you eat food to reduce negative emotions? Now, I think most people would agree that recovery from a food addiction may be more complicated than recovery from other types of addictions. And this is for the obvious reason that you can't abstain from food. If your nutritionist, psychologist, or other professional is treating this as a food addiction, then the help may be in the way of trying to break the cycle of any compulsive behavior. That all sounds very sensible. But recently, there was an article by some respected professionals that treating it simply as an addiction may be not as beneficial as treating food perhaps in a more favorable light because we can't eliminate or avoid this particular object of our addiction. Next week, I'll get into that theory and possible treatment programs for the, for lack of a better phrase, food-friendly treatment. That's all I have for you today. Be well and stay tuned next week for another episode of Healing Outside the Box.